Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on engaging men in women's economic empowerment. My name is Amy Rice, and I am moderating today's webinar on behalf of DCED's Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group. This webinar is one of a series that the working group is putting together, so keep an eye on the DCED website and our social media so you don't miss out on our upcoming webinars. We are incredibly lucky to have Gary Barker with us today to share his immense wealth of knowledge and experience. If you've had even the slightest peek into the world of engaging men in the fight for gender equality or for ending violence, his name will have come up. He's been named one of the world's top 20 most influential people in gender policy and has founded or co-founded some amazing initiatives, the most notable of which is Promundo, which is who he's speaking on behalf of today. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please post them in the chat box in the bottom right of your screen and we'll address them at the end. If you have technical issues, please do the same and we'll do our best to assist you. But as a backup, the webinar will be recorded so you can watch it at a later time if the worst comes to the worst. That's all from me. So Gary, thank you for being here and the floor is yours.
All right, thanks for having me, and I'll put my picture up there. Although I can't see any of you, at least you can see my face. Thanks very much for the invitation, and we're particularly excited. We as an organization are particularly excited about looking at ways that we think about engaging men in women's economic empowerment. I think I've filled up a slideshow on it, but I think it is important to say there's not a lot of experiments, there's not a lot of data. There's a few folks trying to think about how do we in very deliberate, planned, strategic ways think about engaging men as part of women's economic empowerment. So I'm sharing some experiences, but I think it is important to start off with that. There's simply not that much in this space, which is why it's exciting that you all as an organization contributing to a huge amount of both direct actions, but also learning about what works in women's economic empowerment is exciting to us. A little bit about us is Promundo. We've existed now for nearly 23 years. Our work is focusing very much on, as it says there, about engaging men and boys in partnership with women, girls, and individuals of all gender identities for achieving gender equality. And we do that across work in caregiving and engaging men around in their roles as fathers and caregivers. We do a lot of work around violence prevention. We do a growing amount of work, or at least thinking about this topic of engaging men as allies in women's economic empowerment. We do a lot of work that's focused on youth. How do we change harmful, restrictive ideas about masculinity starting from younger ages? And then about half of what we do is research. So all of that work is grounded in the significant amount of research that we've been doing globally. We're partner offices across 5 countries. That's Brazil, the US, where I'm based now. I founded the organization in Brazil, and then we opened our US office now close to 10 years ago. Also offices in DRC, in Portugal, and in Chile. So where are we on this conversation of are men buying into gender equality, including accepting and supporting women's roles as full-on providers and economically active as much as men are? That's a question we get a lot. That's a question we've been asking a lot. On the one hand, we're coming up on 25 years of the Beijing conference. There's been huge efforts in at least that long to say, what does an equal world look like? And where are men in terms of thinking about that and accepting it? I think we can say from many years of research from a study, a set of studies that we call the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, and there's a map of places that we've carried it out or different versions of it. This is an effort that we started in 2008 with a number of partner organizations to ask in household survey research men ages 18 to 65 and also talking to women to say, where are men on gender equality in their lived practices, in their attitudes, and we also ask women about that as well. So we're getting responses from men and women about where men are on gender equality. It is now, as you can see there, more than 75,000 interviews in these household survey studies. Although the colors on the map suggest that we've actually done the research in that many places, I think it's important to say that in larger countries, it's typically 2 or 3 urban areas. Smaller countries, it typically is a nationally representative sample. It is nonetheless, we think, a good snapshot of where men are on gender equality. So where are they? I think one piece that I'll start with is to talk about unpaid care work. Our research and others on time use, it's really clear just how little we've budged on that. Globally, women carry out about 3.3 times more of the daily care work than men do. That's as a global average. That's kind of the rates in the Americas in terms of the time difference. Some parts of South Asia and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, women do 10 times the amount. In some parts of the global north, Sweden and Iceland, probably the most equitable, women are still doing 1.25 times the amount of daily care work. That issue is not considered very sexy and attractive often, and getting conversations going about the unpaid care inequality and divide is a challenging one. We've been doing since 2015 a global State of the World's Fathers report, looking at what it takes to nudge men further along to be involved caregivers. But I do think that's an important one to talk about, particularly for women's economic empowerment. That is probably close to the top of the single largest barrier in terms of women participating more in the paid work economy. So back to some other headlines from Image's studies. One, we do find, I think it's important just to start with, younger men, urban men, men whose mothers are in the paid workforce tend to have more equitable attitudes. There, we can see a general movement, some regions and some countries accepted, where younger men, the younger generation of men, does seem to be more accepting of women in the workplace and seeing women as their equals. That is pushed ahead even more, as I said before, if your mother worked outside the home. Boys who see that tend to believe that that's a normal thing to happen and that women should be in the workplace as much as men should. In terms of women's participation in the workforce, we see this complex interaction in the Images data that women both report they participate more in paid work if their male partner does more of the care work. And where women are participating outside the workforce, we see that men tell us they do more of the hands-on care work. So we don't know what's causal there, whether it goes both directions, but clearly that's a key issue. And we see that it doesn't get enough attention, or we at least believe it doesn't get enough attention. Nonetheless, even as we see massive shifts in some parts of the world, Latin America in particular, where women are participating much more in the paid workplace, men and women tend to still see men as the primary providers for their households. And we also see in lots of countries sort of a contradictory acceptance of women's economic contributions to the home by men. In qualitative data, and even in some of our survey questions, we find that men are kind of say, yes, we like that income, but still my income is the most important. If we were able to, we'd like that she didn't have to work. So still kind of a primacy given to men's roles as providers. And we think there's a lot of questioning that needs to be done there. There's, I won't go a huge amount into the gender-based violence data, but to find that what we do see is that in a couple of countries, particularly where men have the most conservative attitudes around their roles compared to women's roles, we see that women who work outside the home are subjected to more violence from a male partner. And I'll show a couple of examples from that. The other thing I think it's important to say is that perceptions of men's individually held attitudes are often at odds with what they say their communities think. So what we think that allows us to look into is even in settings where what men believe others around them is that women shouldn't be working, we find that lots of men kind of say, well, we need the income. It makes sense. I'm fine with it. Even as they believe that other men around them don't think it's okay for women to be working outside the home. So we think that gives us some points of entry to engage men around saying, well, maybe if you're able to push against those odds, how can we engage you to be an ally to engage other men in questioning those norms? There is still, even when women are working outside the home, and certainly you see this, there's a lot of support or belief by men that they get to control or need to know where a female partner is at all times. And we find that even in some of the more progressive or more gender equitable parts of the world, this notion that men need to control the movements or at least know where women are continues to be a huge concern around women's participation and a barrier to women's participation in work. I'll go a little bit deeper. That was a lot of data in a very large questionnaire, and there's the but I'll go a little bit deeper into some of these findings. One is just to give an example here of the proportion of women ever reporting any kind of violence versus whether they were employed or unemployed, violence from a male partner. And you see consistently across all the forms of violence, these are statistically significant differences, except for the economic violence one, that women who report that they work outside the home have experienced more lifetime violence from a male partner in Pakistan. We also saw this in Rwanda. We saw this in Mali. We saw this in Afghanistan. In countries where there are more rigid norms prevailing, many men feel threatened when women are working outside the home. So that tells us, you certainly know from other data, from some interventions, that sometimes initial participation by women in economic empowerment activities can result in an increase in violence from a male partner. We don't think that we should stop doing the work. It just tells us that we should think carefully to make sure that our efforts are also engaging men to possibly reduce the chance that happens to a woman when she begins to work outside the home. This is some data from Chile showing where, the slides there in Spanish. Essentially what we're seeing is that where women work outside the home, the orange bar shows that, it's flipped around there. When women work outside the home, men tend to do more care work. And also on the flip side, in some parts of the world where men are unemployed, and their partners employed, they seem to be doing more care work. So again, complex interaction there of whether what drives men to be participating in unpaid care. But we do think in some parts of the world where women are doing or increasing their amount of paid work and men's employment may be stagnant or dropping, men are malleable. We often consider that they aren't, but I think it is important to say there's interesting things we can do taking advantage of women's participation in the workforce to nudge men toward doing more of the care work. Here's some percentages that we have of the question that we asked about men's roles as provider. This is an attitude question. The father's role in caring is mostly as provider. You see high percentages across the world of still believing that men's roles are providers. I didn't show the women's responses there, but they were quite close in terms of still this belief that the main things that men can do at the household level is as providers. So we've still got some work to do on the norms issue. So stepping away from that household data, which I think gives us some insights on what's happening in terms of change, men's reactions to their unemployment or employment status, men's reactions to women's employment status, which does suggest that men are, as I said before, pliable and changeable. We've also been doing a review of cash transfer programs as one, I don't know if we want to call that a women's economic empowerment initiative or initiatives, but the vast majority of these globally, funds are given on a monthly basis to mothers or to women in households with children below a certain age who are living below the poverty line. Latin America has been as many of you know, Latin America has been the kind of pioneer of these programs, but they've since been scaled up and taken to many other parts of the world. Probably two of the biggest ones in the world are in Colombia and Brazil, where they reach nearly 20% of households. The Familias en Acción program in Colombia reaches fully 20% of households in Colombia. Brazil's Bolsa Familia program reaches, depending on the year, upwards of 15% of all households. So these are massive programs giving a monthly amount to mothers in households living below the poverty line. Chopra did a review in 2013. We just did an updated review of more than 100 of these. Her 2013 review found none that aimed to engage men in redistributing care work. We found 3, and then they're listed there on the slide. All of them showed evidence of change, that if we do try to nudge men to do more of the care work, in fact, men are doing so little of it in some settings that a little nudge goes a long way. And we can see these are huge sample sizes because of how big the programs are. So they're not massive shifts in men's participation in care work, but I think it is important to say men will change. And if we have deliberate efforts of engaging them as allies in supporting their partners in doing this, we think that's a key next way forward. I think it's important to say that as we're doing some work both in Colombia and in Brazil with the 2 cash transfer programs that I mentioned, looking at some creative ways to engage men. One of the things we want men to do, of course, is to be doing more of this hands-on care work, as you see in the photo here. But we also want men to be supportive of their female partners entering the paid workplace. And so looking at ways, some households will look at this income and say, this is great. We don't need to pay for someone to provide care for the child. She can stay at home. That's not a bad thing if a household wants to make that decision. But we think more needs to be done, that men can be very deliberate about supporting a partner to when they want to, for her to be able to enter the paid workplace instead of seeing her work as secondary and her work as secondary, because we know how that drives into a spiral that men's income will continue to increase. That salary gap between women and men then does not decrease. So trying to trouble those programs, to call it that, to think more deliberately about being gender transformative in bigger, more dramatic ways. So you all know these things. This is based on the different reviews of what factors we know are implicated in terms of whether women's economic empowerment works. Mobility, the unpaid care issue I've been talking a lot about, whether women are subjected to violence that I've also been talking about, legal rights, who makes decisions at the household, access and control of resources, access to information. These are all the factors that, among others, that we know are involved in whether women's economic empowerment works. I think looking across those, there's a lot, men's views and attitudes, men's decision-making power, attitudes about who does what at the home in the household level are all implicated in all of these. And as I said at the beginning, there's not a lot of research of kind of where what men and masculinities have to do with those different aspects. I think it's fair to say that many women's economic empowerment programs increase women's ability to achieve changes in their own participation in the workplace and somewhat men's behaviors, as well as accessing paid employment, but they don't necessarily change the broader social order, particularly around masculinities and men's power, that gives rise to women's disadvantage. And we think that's because a lot of them don't ask the questions of what are some of these root causes, particularly looking at men's power and men's attitudes, men's control. I think it's fair to say that most women's economic empowerment programs have not viewed men as allies in the process. Many of the reports will talk about men as barriers, which is true in many cases, but don't really see, well, could we flip that? Could we envision men being allies in this process? And very few, as I noted before, have really sought to engage men in deliberate ways. So what have we learned from a couple of experiments that we've been involved in? One of the ones that we started off some years back is a partnership with CARE with their village savings and loan model. And again, most of the beneficiaries, 80 to 90%, who took the loans from the loan program were women deliberately. That was the focus of the program. And it's a program that reaches several million across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Last time we checked, there were microcredit and similar kinds of programs reaching more than 100 million women, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So as you know, the microcredit model and access to credit has been one of the popular models out there. Very few of those, I think a similar conclusion about cash transfer programs, very few of those have sought to engage men in deliberate ways. So we've done an experiment together with CARE, found that if you did business as usual, focusing on women, or if you engage men in safe spaces for dialogue and reflection with group education sessions that included some information for men about how they could benefit from either cash transfer or other income generation programs, information about health, couple dynamics, engaging men with some of the same things that we train women in such programs around. Some of the sessions were for men only, and then some were with couples. That we saw some very striking results. One, there was greater economic gains in the households where men were deliberately engaged. Men showed increased support for their partner's participation in income generation activities. There was greater couple communication, reduction in couple conflict, and greater involvement by men in care work. This is a comment from one of the men. He said, our culture, referring to his local culture, his village, has changed. The assignment I got was to clean outside the house with a broom. But when the neighbors came, I was hiding the broom. They kept asking me, "What are you doing?" And I told them, "I'm not poisoned by my wife. I'm not bewitched." And I kept on doing it. Again, just some very simple stuff of breaking some of these norms that men shouldn't do the care work, making it a collective experiment, not just an individual thing that men did. We found tremendous gains. We did, based on that pilot project, which we published in the Gender and Development Journal. We've done some partnering with organizations in other countries, and there is now a randomized controlled trial happening in Rwanda based on that, funded by the What Works initiative, that results will be forthcoming in the next months. There's what's happened since, more than 2,300 couples in Rwanda reached in with this model. Again, there's been not yet an impact evaluation of that. That's forthcoming. But we think it did shift some thinking among a big international organization and in the Rwandan government around the need to deliberately engage men as allies in this process. And we'll be glad to share those evaluation results when they come later this year. But we're quite encouraged that it didn't take a lot. Rwanda is a special case in terms of getting participation by men when we created a community norm of inviting men. But all to say, we think there's promise in it. We've been doing some work very deliberately around training men as fathers and engaging men as more equitable and more hands-on fathers with a module that we call Program P for Paternidade, Paternité, that's been implemented in more than 10 countries. We've got randomized control trials in a couple of countries showing that men can be nudged to do more of the hands-on care work. We've not been measuring outcomes related to women's economic participation. A tiny bit, at least we measured in one country. We think there's more promise there in terms of also including a more deliberate conversation or more deliberate partnering of father training activities together with women's economic empowerment. Most of these have been implemented with the health sector. So we're recruiting fathers during the pregnancy or the prenatal period and doing the training typically before or right after the birth of a child. We think there's more that could be done to bring in that approach, as I mentioned, with women's economic empowerment activities. So what have we been learning in some of these approaches? One is that we need to move beyond. We've been invited a lot, and a lot of programs have kind of had a simple training of trainers model, which is great. But we think the important aspect is to move into actually changing the program design. So we're not simply doing a kind of later add-on of, oh yeah, we should think about engaging men, but to think deliberately from the beginning of program planning and design to engage men. And to think about both do no harm aspects as well as what kinds of changes could we expect, what kind of mapping of where men are on this issue, and that takes me to the second point. We do find that even in quite rigid conservative places, there's at least some men who, if they've not seen the light of gender equality, they at least begrudgingly say, look, I need her income too. The household needs her income as well. Finding men and finding what their pathways are to being early acceptors so that we don't look in a given setting and say, yeah, there's no men here. They don't like this. They're against it. They're likely to cause violence. To say, well, let's be more nuanced about how we listen to men's varied and plural responses to women's economic empowerment. So we spend a lot of time working with groups on qualitative research at the beginning to find men who are voices of resistance, to call them that, to rigid traditional ideas about manhood, and finding those at least handful of men who already accept and believe that women should be in the paid workplace as much as they should. The third one, I think I've emphasized that a lot. We think the issue of men's caregiving needs to get much more attention. We're doing some global advocacy work as part of our Men Care campaign to get countries to sign on to a simple idea that men should be doing 50% of the hands-on care work, to do pledges within their policies that we actually believe this could happen, and promoting a suite of 6 or 7 policies that we think countries need to enact to get men to be more involved in the hands-on care of children, for multiple reasons, for gender equality in general, for women's economic participation particularly. and because we believe that there's child development and children's rights aspects to it as well. So we think that issue needs much more attention, and needs to be part of gender equality policies, and needs to be more connected to women's economic empowerment. Fourth, we understand that engaging men deliberately in women's economic empowerment can bring risks. And we need to be very careful of measuring and assessing household dynamics so that we reduce that risk of violence that I talked about at the beginning. And that sometimes men will say, yes, well, she's working outside the home, but I control the money. Or I now need to know even more where she is because she's out of my eyesight during the day. So I think we need to be very attuned to the power dynamics and what happens as they shift, and to be more deliberate about efforts that we build in to engage men to reduce the chances that some of those harms happen. And we do think a do no harm management risk strategy needs to be in place. Are we listening carefully to women as we engage men? Not all men should be involved. We need to think about some screening. There are households where violence is chronic, where trauma is involved, where men exert multiple forms of control, and not just the male partner, but others in the household may. So to be careful about acknowledging that there may be some moments that we don't engage all men, and keeping the programming centered on women to ensure that they feel in control of this limited space that in some cases they have. They feel comfortable that they're part of consent for engaging partners in thoughtful ways. We want to be careful as well that we don't end up saying, well, we must engage men, therefore we turn away women because they don't bring their male partner. This has happened in a couple of instances in prenatal services where governments have gotten excited about the need to engage men, which is great, and yet that ended up being interpreted as, well, the woman needs to bring her male partner to a prenatal visit, so if he doesn't come, we will turn her away for a service. That is not the logic that we ever want to promote here. So just making sure that as groups get we think is good, making sure that it's never about discouraging single or unaccompanied women from accessing the services we're talking about. And making sure that as we bring men into these conversations, we don't kind of give men a new space where they control access over women's assets, mobility, etc. We have to make sure that we keep a do no harm lens on, but we do believe at the same time that we've got to believe that men can change and can be involved in positive ways. There's a few of the resources, and I can share others. Our website is pretty much up to date of different resources that we've produced on this. Our current engagement with some of the big cash transfer programs in the world are not yet up, and we'll be putting some resources up there as we try to contribute to this learning. And as I said before, really thrilled that DCED is interested in this topic, because it is really, there's a huge amount of learning that still needs to take place in this space. There's not that many experiments. So if anything comes out of my talk, I hope that you all are encouraged to try more of it. Let me stop there. That was 30 minutes without much of a breath for me. So let me stop and take some questions and comments, and we can go back to any of the slides if I went through them quickly.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting. Really great to have you drawing on practical implications and recommendations, as well as the findings from your survey. Absolutely fascinating. And we've already got some questions coming in. I'm sure more will come, so please do keep checking them in the chat box. Then we'll start with Stacey's question. Is about the violence. I know that's one of the slides that really stood out for me as being quite harrowing about women in work have an even worse chance of being the victim of violence. And she's asking if you have any practical examples of some safeguarding practices that organisations can do if they want to promote women's employment and economic empowerment, but then not put them at risk of that kind of harm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main one, and to be absolutely transparent, it happened to us in the various studies, both the training of men in some of our program P and fatherhood training, as well as some of the partnerships directly with women's economic empowerment, particularly the village savings and loan model. The most, I think the most important thing was having in place a very clear and quick response, so that if incidences of violence were happening, we could both partner with local service provision. Rwanda has been one of the places that set up its one-stop centers across the country, and also to have local access to services so that women could immediately report to one of the facilitators or seek help when she experienced violence. It was not our job, of course, given that countries have laws in places and countries that have mechanisms that should be working better in terms of responding to those cases. What was really important was to have a quick response system. So that would be, having lists of, some of this stuff is fairly obvious, but having lists of telephone numbers of the supervisors who could be reached when an incident came up. Our biggest thing was to make sure that we had a quick response. We do have to acknowledge in some of the settings where we work, where violence is quite high, that it's already happening. We are not, it's not only happening in the context of our programming, but we wanted to make sure that we had a very quick response, that facilitators looked at their own attitudes about it and didn't take this as business as usual by men, just as we wanted women in the programming to not take it as, well, he normally does that, so I just have to figure out a strategy that I stay away from him. We wanted to make sure that the reporting was quick and that responses in terms of referring women to services was also fast. So I think it is mostly about making sure that we are listening to women. We're making sure that our facilitators don't take this as business as usual when men use violence, and to acknowledge that we build on and use the existing service base in terms of reporting incidents. There's all kinds of safety issues that we also asked the local, in the case of Rwanda, we asked the One Stop Service Center staff to give our facilitators training around what that looks like. Other countries, we've done similar things to basically build some of the linkages with the existing protective services. Now, that's easier to do in countries like Chile and Brazil and Colombia where such services exist. It becomes more complicated in some lower income settings where the protection mechanisms in place for women survivors are much more limited. There, it's been building on community supports that exist, but making sure that women had someone to report to, even if the ability of the government to provide state-supported protection was limited. So yeah, we've got some checklists that we could share. I think it really is contextual, but our main issue has been having a quick reporting system, making sure facilitators are on board, that they also believe that men's violence is not the norm that we accept, and that women felt they could easily and quickly tell without suffering repercussions from a male partner or someone else.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that really helpful and insightful answer. Next up, I've got a question about some pull mechanisms that projects have used to engage men. So how do you incentivize them to get involved and enroll in caregiving programs, etc.?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because, often men are working 10, depending on a setting, obviously 10, 12 hours somewhere else. I would say all of the above. Some cases we may, in a given setting, we may engage a workplace. If men are employed in a particular industry where there's a lot of men in a setting, to see if we can get that workplace to be on board with us. We will engage religious leaders, community leaders. We will sometimes try to set up, we've done in Brazil and Colombia, we've done a Saturday morning kind of play activity for fathers and their young children, and then offered lunch for them and had some talks on how men can do this better. We've done things like, as part of that, a children's book, a T-shirt, some clothing for a child, a small stipend may be necessary in some places to get men kind of primed to come into the activity. I think if we can, we're also looking at home visitation in the case of Brazil, where there are home visitors who do the well baby visit. They're typically only talking to moms. We're doing, something as simple as, can we do one of those a month and see if the father's present? So make that on a Saturday morning or maybe midday on a Saturday, and at least do some conversation of saying, hey, dad, or another man in the household, it'd be great if we'd love to say hello to you as well. We have been very careful, and certainly programs don't want to make it a criteria that, that women have to engage their male partner. So we've been very careful about never making that a criteria for women's participation in a given either cash transfer or a women's economic empowerment activity. But we do think there's some things at the beginning to say, oh, maybe if there's literacy, et cetera, you might be able to have a brochure that's targeted men and say, what you can do to be a strong partner here. Community events in rural settings where you kind of invite men out and make them feel kind of good for what they should be doing anyway. But kind of say, hey, men, we need you to be on board with us. Get some community leaders around that. Again, perhaps a meal or some kind of community gathering we've also done in some settings. So it's really, I don't think there's any one size fits all, but it is trying to be creative about some small things that we can do to get men in the door. We've also tried to be responsive of what men ask for. Sometimes the groups, if we do group education with male partners, we certainly want them to be allies for women's empowerment, but we also want to open it up for things that men don't get to talk about very often. Sometimes men will say, oh, we'd like some of the information that our partners are getting about access to markets, et cetera. Or you're also including a conversation about reproductive health for our partners. We'd like to talk about men's health and our own health. So also being responsive to some things that men might want to talk about in those spaces. Engaging some male facilitators, kind of obvious, but sometimes engaging men from the community to be hey, men, let's talk about this, can be an obvious thing that we also try.
Fantastic. So many, like you say, creative options out there. And hopefully lots of people to take away from that. Next, Meredith's asking if you could expand on the intersection between male engagement and gender equality for children.
Yeah, I mean, what we see as a pretty constant finding across the images survey. So we haven't yet carried out images over time. So what we do is compare across age groupings. As I mentioned, we carry out the survey with populations 18 to 65 in most countries, sometimes 18 to 55, but mostly 18 to 65. So we divide that into 3 age groupings, and we can compare the younger generation to the older. And we can also ask you retrospective questions. So we've got quite a few questions about your childhood experiences. Men who report their father or another male in the household was involved in their upbringing in hands-on care work are more likely to report that they're involved in hands-on care work as adults. They are also more likely to be supportive of women's participation in the workplace. So what children see, women who report that a male caregiver, father, biological or otherwise, was involved in care work in the household, or where they saw more equitable decision-making in the household growing up, are more likely to believe that their male partners should be involved in care work, and more likely to have more empowered, autonomous ideas about their own roles in the world. It seems fairly obvious, but I think it is important to say, yeah, equitable parenting is a motor for gender equality later on. What children see is what we practice. The other finding that we see is that where boys are nudged to do caregiving or to do more household chores as children, they're more likely to be involved in hands-on caregiving as they become adults. Kind of an obvious finding, but we think it's useful to point out that's what we need to do. Some of this training for what we do about father training is to say your children need to see you doing this, and you should also be trying to raise your children in equitable ways. So I think it is what you are doing in terms of supporting women's economic empowerment also pays forward. Men who report their mothers worked, as I said at the very beginning, are more likely to believe their own partners and support their own female partners in working later on. So this really is, this is gender equality that pays forward. And I think we maybe don't do enough of holding up those results as well as of what this means for children who are witnessing more gender equitable households in the form of women working outside the home and men doing care work. That becomes normal for children who see that. And maybe we should use that more in terms of how we promote this to donors and governments, that this is paying forward for a generation of younger people who we hope believe and try to live gender equality even more than their parents did.
Great, thank you for that, and gives us hope that hopefully in a few generations' time we'll have seen some quite rapid changes. Next, a question that came in when people were registering for the event got how men in the workplace contribute to gender equity in women-friendly workplaces.
Yeah, that's a challenging one. I mean, I think we've been doing a little bit of U.S.-based research on kind of where men are in this Me Too moment, and a few interesting things coming out. And again, have less on this from maybe some other settings, but I think some of those findings might hold up. We've got a lot. I mean, I think as the world becomes more urban and certainly middle income parts of the world, there is an increasing belief that women should be equals in the workplace. So at least more men believe that and say that, or tell us that, at least in household surveys. When we ask the what, is her work as important as mine, or if work is the question often asked in World Value Survey and some other questions, it is asked along if work is scarce, is men's work more important? Many men and women say yes to that one, that we're still often stuck in this belief that, she should be equal, but if things are tough, my income and my work matters more. We also find that lots of men say, I want to be an ally for gender equality in the workplace. But when we ask women about how much men are allies for gender equality in the workplace, it's far, far less than men say. What we've been recommending is several things. One, we need men to listen to women about what's going on. Women tell us they want men to speak up when they hear egregious incidents of inequality, when they look at and know the salary and pay inequalities existing in most workplaces, that they want men to be allies who speak up, particularly toward other men. The issues of harassment at the workplace certainly come up a huge amount, and the numbers that we have across the world range from 20 to 60% of women say they've ever experienced some form of harassment in the workplace. Most of the time, women don't feel there's any men in the workplace they can talk to about it. Although in a couple of surveys, we've seen that men say they would be good allies in listening. We just don't know who they're listening to, because women don't seem to be perceiving that in many places. So I think the listening, the speaking up, transparency, making visible hiring patterns, salary differentials, women's participation at all levels of organizations from leadership on down. We think, and certainly the UK has advanced some on that in some of its public workplace assessments of gender equality. Those kinds of transparency mechanisms we also think are important. Together with that, we think nudging men to do more of the care work. Where it makes sense to have paid parental leave, we think it makes sense everywhere to have paid parental leave, making sure that that's equal for men and women, and then creating workplace culture that says men take the leave. We've engaged with a couple of companies and actually a couple of countries that are looking at making paternity leave obligatory. So we're not making it voluntary if men want to take some time off to do caregiving for a child, that we make that time, that allocated time, obligatory. Some corporations are trying that. I think the bottom line is it takes a long time. It takes resources and commitment from all levels of leadership. And we need men to vote with their voices and to be vocal advocates on this. All the above. It's not an easy one for sure.
But lots, it sounds that there is to be done. So very promising there. Another question here from Ariola. Wondering so he says, I've noticed in my work as gender practitioners that using a field-friendly lingo helps a lot with addressing gender equality issues. What was your experience with your community events?
Using field-friendly lingo? Is that what?
Yeah. That's the one.
Yeah, I mean, all the language that we use to talk about gender and gender transforming programming, and the language we create as practitioners and researchers is not, I have in these slides is not the way that we're talking to men about the work. Behind the Men Care campaign, and certainly lots of what we've been working with governments around, is how to bring men in the door in language that makes sense to them, while not allowing them to continue to fall back on gender inequitable and harmful and sometimes misogynist language and practices. So yes, on field-friendly lingo, we do, and that's why my bias, of course, as a as a researcher, as well as that we do lots of qualitative research up front to hear how men are discussing this, to unpack our own assumptions rather than kind of going in with a lens that we often can as the middle income, or sometimes staff from the big city or from somewhere else. We can often look at men in deficit ways, and I think really becomes important in work with men that we listen where they're starting. We don't want to at all give space to some of the harmful practices and language they may be using, but we do have to kind of do a lot of listening first, figuring out pathways and language they use that gets them closer to gender equality, even though they're not yet reformed, fully enlightened, gender equitable Scandinavian men, to call them that. There's a lot of listening that we have to do, and some of it's not. Much of it is really painful to do, because field-friendly lingo can sometimes be sexist and misogynist. So how do we listen to that and try to nudge men in the right direction, while we also hold them accountable appropriately to language and practice and behaviors that they carry out that might cause harm? So that's a delicate one. I don't think there's a formula, but I do think listening, doing some good qualitative research up front, listening to men and women about men's views is really a great start. And making sure that our language is positive about men. I think there's too many messages out there that kind of present men are the problems. Being positive and proactive and optimistic that men can do the right thing, while also being accountable, holding men accountable for language and practices that are harmful.
Thanks for sharing those insights there. I think you might have touched on this a bit in your presentation, but just wanted to add any more to the idea of how do we engage men while ensuring that they don't set the terms of the conversation or hijack the agenda and take it away from the women.
Yeah. And that can help. And I think some of the main practices continue to be that we're also listening to women about their male partners. I think when we do group education approaches, moments where women feel safe and they've got some of their training or group spaces, and we know how much women's access to that social capital has been a key issue in terms of reducing violence and in empowering women to be in paid work. So not giving up on those, not just kind of inviting men in, we just need men in the room now. Some spaces where, those safe spaces for women, I think, need to be kept. And then other spaces where we want the couples to be together, and some spaces where men are alone. I think that kind of gender synchronized approach, we think, makes the most sense. And then if we as facilitators are listening in attuned ways to what happens in those three different spaces, I think there's a lot less chance that men can It also means a lot of time spent with facilitators on making sure they've unpacked and they're critically aware of their own gender biases. And I realize that sounds very easy for me to say on this side of a slide presentation, because we're trying to reach numbers in this programming. We're trying to reach efficiency. You all in your programming are trying to reach lots of numbers. Brazil is reaching 11 million households with Bolsa Familia. So we realize as we say, add this in, that is a huge lift to get that kind of thoughtful gender synchronized programming happening across so many households. But we do think we need to say that. You don't have to do that all the time, but to be attuned that your facilitators have access to information that questions their own beliefs about this stuff, that you think deliberately about making sure women have a way they can speak without their male partner being present, that they feel safe there, and that we've also got some kind of space where we engage men in those conversations, online, spontaneous groups, organized groups, drop-in centers, monthly or once a quarter conversations with men at a community level. Many ways to do that, but I think those really to us are the key components, even as we understand how challenging that is to roll out across big programs.
Great, thank you for that one as well. Looks like the audience hasn't got any more questions at the moment, so I'm just going to ask one of my own. I'm wondering, what's been the most rewarding program that you've worked on in your time in this field?
Yeah, good question. I suppose we do some work in some of the most challenging parts of the world. You've seen the list of our offices. Our work in DRC and Brazil in particular has been in settings where, security firms will tell you not to go, and that have often been seen as, well, parts of DRC labeled as the rape capital of the world, parts of Brazil, particularly favelas and some of the urban violence, as kind of inherently violent, and that men in such settings must be inherently harmful. And I think finding in settings such as that there are men desiring and living ideas of equality, that thoughtful interventions can help men and couples and households move toward nonviolent, cooperative couple relationships, is fairly obvious that it can happen, but also amazing to see it in some of the difficult settings like this, which are not all that different than some of the urban areas we work in the US. So I suppose those have been both encouraging to see how much men can change if we listen, respect, provide pathways, but also that those who look at men in such settings as bringers of harm, to change their views about Congolese or Brazilian men or men of color in the US, we also see as important. Part of the challenge of looking at men in the global South is how much a lot of the international development discourses that have been of men as bringers of harm, that men in some parts of the world are, we believe, that sometimes the messages are that men in such settings are inherently stuck in an inequitable view of manhood. And I think a lot of our work, where it feels satisfying, is where we've been able to change not only men, but change those who design programs and look at such men saying they're bringers of harm. So I'm thrilled when we can get policymakers, international donors, who may have before said, oh, Indian men will never change, Pakistani men will never change, and to say, we beg to differ, and here's some evidence that the mind shift happens not only in men, but also those who look outside at men in diverse places of the world.
Thank you for sharing that. I imagine it's pretty special to see there's hope where it might have seemed most unlikely. I think that's all the questions we have. So we'll probably wrap up. Did you have any final comments you wanted to make before we end the webinar?
No, I think I'll just repeat. Very excited that you all are interested in the topic. As I mentioned before, let me step back 1 second. I think it's important to affirm, as you all know, that women's economic empowerment in different modalities has been one of the development success stories. And as we engage in partnerships with cash transfer programs, village savings and loan approaches, enterprise development, vocational training programs that are focused on women, we're very cognizant of how much you don't want to change what's working. And so really seeing this work about engaging men to say, you can do better what you do if you engage men. This is not about throwing out what you do. And I think engaging the decision makers about such programs to say, you can make them even more gender transformative by bringing men to the equation. We're not at all suggesting you throw out the models. And I think you all, as a significant voice in the space, being able to build this into some of your programming would be, has really a strong potential to be a normative way that programming begins to happen with women's economic empowerment, if groups like DCED and others make it part of their normal practice. So count us as interested in, sharing information or collaborating in other ways. We think, you as a group are in a particularly strategic opportunity to shift the practice. Because as I presented earlier in this, there's just not many examples that are happening in the large scale programming around women's economic empowerment of engaging men in very strategic and deliberate ways. So if we can support your programming and doing that, by sharing information, by adding to the cause, include us as part of that equation and discussion.
I have no doubt that watching this today is going to lead to many conversations, and hopefully we do start seeing more of this integrated into the programming that everyone's doing. So thank you so much for your time, Gary. Thank you everyone who participated. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for just being online. like I said, there'll be more webinars coming out as part of the series later on in the year, so keep your eyes out for that. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thanks again for inviting me.